past few years, new evidence has come to light that shows that humans have been occupying North America for far longer than we once thought. We know that the Clovis culture wasn't the first to inhabit North America, as multiple different archaeological sites have revealed evidence to us.
The desert was quiet. It had been quiet for 15,000 years, in the rain shadow of central Oregon, where sagebrush stretches unbroken toward a sky that never seems to end. A series of shallow caves sat carved into volcanic rock, unremarkable to anyone passing by. Ranchers had sheltered cattle there. Hikers barely glanced at them. For generations, these cavities in the earth held no particular significance to anyone except the wind. Then, in the summer of 2002, an archaeologist named Dennis Jenkins crawled inside one of those caves, with a trowel, a headlamp, and a question that would take him a decade to answer. What he pulled from the dust-dry sediment, carefully, centimeter by centimeter, would eventually force an entire scientific discipline to reconsider one of its most foundational claims. It wasn't gold, it wasn't a skeleton, it wasn't even a tool, it was human waste. Ancient, desiccated, 14,300-year-old human feces, coprolites, preserved in the cold, dry darkness of the Paisley 5-Mile Point Caves, and when the DNA was extracted, tested, retested, and confirmed across multiple independent laboratories, the result was unambiguous. Human beings had lived in Oregon more than 1,000 years before the so-called first Americans were supposed to have existed anywhere on this continent. The textbook story, the one taught in every university, printed in every encyclopedia, repeated with unwavering confidence for nearly 70 years, said that humans arrived in the Americas approximately 13,000 years ago through an ice-free corridor between glaciers, carrying distinctive stone tools known as Clovis points. That was the consensus. That was settled science. Oregon said otherwise, and the Paisley Caves were only the beginning. In the years that followed, site after site across the state would yield evidence that pushed human presence in the region deeper and deeper into the past, so deep that some researchers now whisper about timelines that the mainstream has not yet accepted. What happened in Oregon? And why has it taken so long for the world to listen? To understand why Oregon's discoveries carry such weight, one must first understand the theory they threaten. In 1932, near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, archaeologists discovered a distinctive style of fluted stone, projectile points in direct association with the bones of Ice Age megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant bison. Radiocarbon dating placed these artifacts at approximately 13,000 years before present. Over the following decades, similar Clovis points were found across North America, from coast to coast, always dating to roughly the same narrow window. From this evidence, a dominant paradigm emerged. The Clovis people were the first humans in the Americas. They had crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Bering Land Bridge, exposed during the last ice age when sea levels dropped, and traveled south through an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, approximately 13,500 years ago. Once south of the glaciers, they spread rapidly across 2 continents. This became known as the Clovis-First model. For nearly 7 decades, it was the orthodox position in North American archaeology. Any site claiming pre-Clovis human occupation faced extraordinary skepticism. Careers were damaged. Papers were rejected. The model was defended with institutional ferocity. Even within the mainstream, cracks appeared. Monte Verde in Chile, excavated by Tom Dillehay beginning in 1977, presented evidence of human occupation, dating to approximately 14,500 years before present. A full 1,500 years before Clovis, the site was bitterly contested for 2 decades, before a visiting committee of skeptics personally inspected the evidence in 1997 and largely accepted its validity. Other pre-Clovis candidate sites: Meadowcroft Rockshelter in Pennsylvania, Buttermilk Creek in Texas, Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, each contributed to a growing body of evidence suggesting that the Clovis-First model was incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. Some researchers have proposed dramatically earlier dates for human arrival in the Americas: 20,000, 30,000, even 130,000 years ago at the controversial Cerruti Mastodon site in California. These extreme claims remain highly contested and are not accepted by the majority of scholars. They represent the speculative frontier, not the consensus. Oregon's contribution falls somewhere between the cautious mainstream and the radical fringe, and that is precisely what makes it so powerful. The Paisley Caves presented a very specific problem for defenders of the old model, and it was a problem that could not be easily dismissed. Unlike many pre-Clovis candidate sites, which relied on stone tools that skeptics could argue were naturally fractured rocks or contaminated stratigraphic layers, the Paisley Caves offered something unprecedented: direct biological evidence. Human DNA extracted from coprolites, found in sealed, undisturbed sedimentary layers that were independently dated by multiple radiocarbon laboratories. The dates came back consistently, 14,300 years before present. Some samples pushed slightly older. All predated Clovis, but here was the deeper anomaly. The stone tools found in the same layers were not Clovis points. They were a different technology entirely, what researchers came to call Western-stemmed tradition points. These were leaf-shaped, stemmed projectile points, with no fluting, no resemblance to Clovis technology whatsoever. This raised an unsettling question. If the first Americans were Clovis people, carrying Clovis technology, arriving through an ice-free corridor from the north, then who were these people in Oregon? Where did they come from? And why did their tools look nothing like what the first Americans were supposed to have carried? The implications were staggering. Perhaps Clovis was not the origin of human settlement in the Americas. Perhaps Clovis was merely one tradition among many, one branch on a much older, much more complex tree. And if that were true, then the entire story of how and when humans populated the Western Hemisphere needed to be rewritten. But the Paisley Caves were not alone. Insert original clip here. Suggested source: University of Oregon or Dennis Jenkins lecture or interview. Search term: Dennis Jenkins, Paisley Caves, Western Stemmed Points, lecture. In the years following the Paisley Caves revelation, Oregon continued to deliver. Rimrock Draw Rockshelter, located in the high desert of Harney County, was excavated beginning in 2011 by a team under the Bureau of Land Management, later involving archaeologist Patrick O'Grady. The site yielded stone tools beneath a layer of volcanic ash from the Mount St. Helens S eruption, geologically dated to approximately 15,800 years ago. If the stratigraphic context holds, and it remains under active investigation, this would represent one of the oldest known archaeological sites in North America. The dating is not universally accepted. Some researchers urge caution, noting that the stratigraphy is complex and that further confirmation is needed, but the preliminary results have been presented at professional conferences and published in peer-reviewed contexts. In 2019, Dr. Loren Davis of Oregon State University published results from Cooper's Ferry in western Idaho, just across the Oregon border, demonstrating human occupation dating to approximately 16,000 years before present. The stone tools bore striking resemblance to artifacts from late Pleistocene Japan, leading Davis to propose a coastal migration route from northeastern Asia, traveling by watercraft along the Pacific Rim rather than walking through an interior ice-free corridor. Modern optically stimulated luminescence dating, accelerator mass spectrometry, radiocarbon dating, and ancient DNA extraction techniques, including next-generation sequencing, have transformed what is possible. Microscopic traces that would have been invisible or untestable 20 years ago can now yield precise chronological data. Additionally, environmental DNA analysis, the detection of ancient genetic material preserved in sediments rather than in discrete artifacts, is now being applied to cave sites across the Pacific Northwest. This technology allows researchers to detect human presence even in the absence of tools, bones, or coprolites. It detects the invisible footprint of occupation itself. While artificial intelligence has not been centrally deployed in the Paisley Caves or Rimrock Draw research specifically, machine learning algorithms are increasingly used in archaeological contexts for pattern recognition in lithic analysis, predictive site modeling, and the classification of fragmented genetic sequences. AI can process vast datasets and identify statistical patterns that human analysts might miss, but it cannot replace field excavation, stratigraphic interpretation, or the careful contextual judgment that distinguishes a genuine artifact from a natural formation. It is a tool, not an oracle. The resistance was not subtle. For decades, the Clovis-First model was defended not merely as a hypothesis, but as a boundary, a line that separated credible researchers from fringe theorists. To claim pre-Clovis occupation was, in many departments, to risk professional marginalization. Grant applications were denied. Peer review became a gauntlet. The social dynamics of academic consensus hardened into something resembling orthodoxy. Dennis Jenkins has spoken publicly about the scrutiny his team faced. Every aspect of the Paisley Caves excavation was challenged. Was the DNA contaminated? Had the coprolites migrated downward through the sediment? Were the radiocarbon dates reliable? Could rodent activity have disturbed the stratigraphy? Jenkins and his colleagues addressed each objection methodically. Independent laboratories confirmed the DNA results. Sedimentological analysis demonstrated intact stratigraphy. Additional excavation seasons reinforced the original findings. Slowly, grudgingly, the field began to shift. But the deeper resistance was not about contamination or stratigraphy. It was about what acceptance would mean. If humans were in Oregon 14,300 years ago, using non-Clovis technology, living in the Great Basin, adapted to a lakeside environment that no longer exists, then the Bering Land Bridge Corridor model was, at minimum, incomplete. And if Cooper's Ferry pushed the timeline to 16,000 years, and if Rimrock Draw's preliminary dates of 15,800 years held, then the entire framework of American prehistory required not revision but replacement. Some senior scholars have cautiously acknowledged this. Others continue to advocate for caution, arguing that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the full picture remains unclear. The tension is real, it is ongoing, and it plays out in conference halls, journal pages, and funding decisions to this day. No one is alleged to be suppressing evidence, but the sociology of scientific paradigm change, as Thomas Kuhn described it decades ago, is clearly visible in how these discoveries have been received. Most archaeologists now accept that humans were present in the Americas before Clovis. The question is no longer whether pre-Clovis occupation occurred, but when, where, and by what route. The current mainstream allows for arrival between 16,000 and 20,000 years ago, likely via a coastal route, along the Pacific. Oregon's sites fit comfortably within this revised framework. The Paisley Caves are acknowledged as legitimate. The Clovis-First model is effectively retired, though its ghost lingers in some textbooks. A smaller but growing group of researchers argues that the evidence points to much earlier human presence, potentially 20,000 to 30,000 years ago or more. They point to sites like Rimrock Draw, the White Sands footprints in New Mexico, dated to approximately 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, and published in Science in 2021, and controversial Brazilian sites. Under this view, Oregon's discoveries are not anomalies, but confirmations of a much deeper timeline that mainstream archaeology has been slow to accept. This position is speculative, but increasingly discussed. Some researchers maintain that while pre-Clovis sites are real, the evidence remains thin, and that caution is warranted. They argue that a few coprolites and stone tools do not constitute robust evidence of sustained, widespread pre-Clovis occupation. They note that many pre-Clovis candidate sites have been later discredited or remain controversial. Under this view, Oregon's findings are important but should not be overinterpreted. The picture remains fragmentary, and patience is required. Each of these positions is held by credentialed, published researchers. The debate is genuine, ongoing, and unresolved. Step back from the stratigraphy. Step back from the radiocarbon dates, the coprolites, the projectile points, the academic conferences. Consider what it means. 14,000 years ago, at minimum, human beings stood in what is now Oregon. They looked out over a landscape that no living person has ever seen. Vast pluvial lakes shimmering under Ice Age skies, grasslands teeming with megafauna, mountains capped with glaciers that extended far beyond their modern remnants. They built fires in caves. They shaped stone into tools. They raised children. They buried their dead. They told stories, and for 70 years, modern science said they didn't exist. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the framework wasn't ready to receive it. Because the human institutions that produce knowledge are themselves subject to inertia, pride, and the gravitational pull of consensus. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is a story about the nature of knowledge itself, how it advances, how it resists, how it eventually, sometimes painfully, corrects course. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the Burns Paiute, the Klamath, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, have oral traditions that speak of deep, ancient roots in this land. Traditions that describe landscapes transformed by ice, and flood traditions that Western science long dismissed as mythology. Now, piece by piece, the archaeological record is catching up to what oral tradition always remembered. There is a humility in this, a recognition that the stories people tell about their own past, passed down across hundreds of generations, may contain truths that peer-reviewed journals are only now beginning to confirm. Oregon's high desert, silent and vast, has guarded these truths with patience. The land does not argue. It does not publish papers. It simply waits for someone to ask the right question, in the right place, with the right tools. And when they finally did, the answer changed everything. Here is what remains unknown. If humans were in Oregon 14,300 years ago, and possibly 15,800 years ago, then where were they at 20,000 years? At 25,000? The coastal route hypothesis suggests that the earliest migrants traveled by watercraft along the Pacific coastline during the last glacial maximum. But those ancient coastlines are now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, risen since the ice melted. The evidence, if it exists, may lie beneath the sea, beyond the reach of current archaeology. The caves of Central Oregon may represent not the beginning of human presence in the Americas, but merely the earliest inland trace of a coastal population that had already been here for thousands of years before anyone ventured away from the shore. If that is true, if the real story of human arrival is written on a drowned continental shelf, then everything we have found so far may be only the epilogue of a much longer narrative. Oregon did not simply push the timeline back. It shattered the illusion that the timeline was ever settled. It revealed that the history of our own species on this continent is not a straight line from point A to point B, but a vast, branching, largely uncharted territory of which we have explored only the shallowest edge. The caves are still there. The desert is still quiet. And somewhere beneath the dust, beneath the volcanic ash, beneath the silence of 15,000 years, there may be answers that no one has yet thought to look for. The question is no longer whether humans were here before Clovis. The question is, how much of this story are we still missing? What do you think? How old is the real story of humans in the Americas? Leave your thoughts below.